Hello. I want to talk about the British Empire. This is a absolutely pivotal aspect of our history. I mean, you cannot talk about the history of the United Kingdom without thinking of the British Empire. I'm not going to make this so exhaustive because, my goodness, it would require hours and hours and hours of video to discuss all the issues around empire. And it's a subject I have thought a lot about. So I don't intend to do that in this video, but I do want to discuss the concept of apology, the concept of legacy, and the concept of how we approach it today. And I'm specifically thinking of India as opposed to our other colonies. Um, so I've watched a documentary and I've read an article by two British Indians who both offer interesting perspectives on important events in India. One of them is on the Amritsar massacre, which occurred exactly 100 years ago today. The other is on Operation Blue Star, which occurred in post independence India under the government of Indira Gandhi. That documentary was made 7 years ago in 2012 by the BBC correspondent Sonia Dal. And for her, it was a very personal journey. She is a Sikh, and she spoke about how that journey, how going to Amritsar, how meeting with survivors of the massacre, people who are still seeking justice, had kind of brought her on a personal journey to explore her faith to the point where she would like to revert to her Sikh name, but because she's a broadcaster, it would be she wasn't quite ready to go down that path. And the other angle is an article in Times, the Times supplement, Times the magazine, and it is by Safnan Sanghera. And he also visited Amritsar more recently to explore the 1919 massacre. This is the article. So it's an interesting article, 4 pages long. It's an extract of a documentary he made for Channel 4. Um, okay, both accounts are interesting. Why are they linked? Well, they both concern the same city, Amritsar, which of course is a holy city. That Golden Temple is one of the most beautiful buildings on earth. If I ever do visit India, I would definitely like to go there. I think it would be a very poignant place in more ways than one. David Cameron, Sadiq Khan, the Queen, and others have all been to Amritsar. This week, Theresa May expressed regret for the Amritsar massacre, but she stopped short of an apology. Now, this article I want to particularly touch on by Mr. Sanghera. He mentioned growing up in Wolverhampton in the 1960s, experiencing the sort of racism that was cooked up by Enoch Powell and the sort of environment of Britain at that time. I studied in Wolverhampton, so I know the city relatively well. It was really at the forefront of that debate. Powell was the MP for Wolverhampton Southwest, and it's the Midlands is a good place to start in some ways to look at race relations in 20th century Britain. Um, Without doubt, the decolonisation period when countries were getting independence from the 1940s to the 1960s was a very important period of our history as well because it showed, I mean, it changed our national identity from being a superpower to not being a superpower. We're still a great power, but not a superpower. And that change, that loss of global prestige, definitely had an influence on public psyche, national psyche. And I think now with Brexit, there's going to be a lot more questions about national psyche. Anyway, I think the report is quite well written, but there's a few things I take issue with. He doesn't actually conclude about whether he thinks there should be an apology or not, although he says that he's changed his mind on it. As a young man, he said he paid no attention to British colonialism in India. Um, but He does say that he was growing up to learn that the British were the good guys. We defeated the Nazis, we abolished slavery, and I'll just read out a passage here from the article. Um, I'm certainly staggered that my own conventional grammar school education hardly mentioned empire. My A grade in GCSE history leaving me only with a superficial knowledge of the Tudors, Tolland Man, and the Corn Laws. And this is something I've seen a lot from Britons, both British Indian and non and others, say that our education system doesn't cover this. But I think a lot of people who say that, I mean, he's talking about when he was a young man. I guess he's in his 30s or 40s now. I think things have definitely changed over the last 10 years where there has been definitely a left wing um, attitude in British universities, especially, which does show the empire as just evil, the evil, overbearing British who made their wealth from exploitation. That's definitely been the narrative. And so you get left wing student activists who, for example, want to tear down statues of colonial era figures, prime ministers, statues of Queen Victoria, even. And this is not just in the former empire, but here in the UK. I think we have a somewhat complex attitude to empire. I think, have we been fully honest about the past? Perhaps not, but I would contend that we are a lot more open about our past than, say, a country like China. I'll be making a video about the events around Tiananmen Square, climbing up closer to that. But that's just an example. I mean, China's official line on that is it never happened. It's completely censored. So people who say that Britain hides from its colonial crimes, well, it was a British film director who made Gandhi, who covered the massacre and really brought that to a modern audience. That was made in the 80s. We have statues of Gandhi around the country. There's one in Leicester, for example. Um, the crimes of British India are discussed, and British writers, British Indian writers, have written books about this. They're not banned by the government. You know, this isn't seen as sensitive state secrets. It's we as a democracy that values free speech can freely discuss these things, and we should. So I have a problem with the argument that Britain restricts taboos of the past. There may be a legitimate case to be made that we don't fully recognize it as much as we should, but I would strongly argue against the notion that we restrict it. Now, he made an interesting point in his article. He mentioned that one of the arguments against a formal apology, I'll read out this extract. Lots of people I respect have made eloquent arguments against the idea of apology, with historian William Dalrymple pointing out that it would be pointless because Jallianwala Bagh massacre was by no means a worse atrocity committed by the British in India. For that, you should look at events, for example, the British conquest of Bengal in 1757, when the province was left devastated by war and high taxation, then struck by famine, and the women of Bengal suffered mass rape at the hands of East India Company tax collectors. And there were certainly atrocities committed at the time of the 1857 uprising. I don't call it a war of independence because India wasn't a unified state pre-Britain. By the same token, we would be perhaps wrong to call it a mutiny. Technically, that's what it was, but let's call it the events of 1857. Without question, British imperial troops committed atrocities. Some of them sickening atrocities that were just as barbaric as some of the things Islamic terrorists do today. I mean, we would tie men to cannons and blow them up. We would mass rape women, and as he points out, Dyer, this is well into the 20th century, um, was acting out of revenge for the brutal murder of missionaries that did happen. But there was without doubt deep racist attitudes in the likes of General Dyer, and that was permeated throughout empire. Rudyard Kipling definitely displayed them. There were white supremacist attitudes in empire, and I don't think we can deny that. So, as a Briton, how do I feel about all of this? Well, I do strongly feel that we need to be honest about our past. We cannot downplay it. We cannot say it's didn't happen. But very few British people do deny those crimes. They might downplay them, but I haven't heard anyone saying it never happened. Um, the problem with formal apology, and even Mr. Sangera himself acknowledges this, who would apologise? Because an apology indicates personal responsibility. Theresa May, as head of government, would most likely be the person doing it. Our ambassador to India, the Queen, and yet none of those people were even alive at that time. So I think a formal apology, I don't agree with them that we should come round to that, because if we do, then it opens up questions of reparations. And I still maintain, like I said in the previous video, we already give India millions in aid. I sort of wonder, did I make a mistake in linking my view on the events of 1919 with the atrocities committed by within post-independence India? So this other documentary I watched by Sonia Dal, she speaks about the atrocities committed against Sikhs in 1984. Many of them have still never seen justice. All to go after one firebrand Sikh, uh, whose name I now forget, but it's estimated between 8 and 17,000 people were killed in 1984 in the backlash against the assassination of Indira Gandhi. She insisted on having her Sikh bodyguards um, stay by, perhaps as a way of saying that she wasn't against Sikhs. But the backlash was absolutely fanatical. It was mass murder on an enormous scale, and far more people died than the massacre of 1919. Even if you look at the higher estimates of 1919, so the official British estimate was 379 killed. Higher estimates, even by Indian nationalists, suggest the true number was around 2,000, which is awful. It's a lot of people. But the events of 1984, between 8 and 17,000 is the estimate, 3,000 in Delhi alone. And yet, many of the perpetrators of that have never faced justice. That's why I think when we're looking at empire, if if people are saying Britain needs to be honest about its past, I would say the people who are saying that, particularly Indians, need to start by being honest about what's happened in post independence India. Now, India is a vibrant democracy, and at least to a large extent, it's questionable under Modi, but there is freedom of the press, there is rigorous discussion about these things. I was watching NDTV today, New Delhi television, and there's apparently a blame game, excuse me, going on in Indian politics over the events of both 1919 and 1984. And for example, Sikh politicians have been accused of honouring Dyer, not them personally, but their ancestors honoured Dyer. Um, Congress, of course, was a party in power when the events of 1984 and Operation Blue Star happened. So I think both the BJP and Congress cannot claim total innocence, and for that reason, need to think carefully before demonising Britain. I think it's understandable for Indians to say Britain needs to acknowledge this, but I find it a bit galling to say we demand an apology from Britain when no apology has been given to innocent Sikh victims of 1984, or innocent Muslims for that matter who are lynched today over being accused of exporting beef, or innocent Christians killed in pogroms, or innocent Hindus. I mean, post independence India has seen many bloody pogroms. As recently as 2002, possibly thousands were killed in Gujarat. Who was the state minister at that time? Narendra Modi. So I, and this is why I take issue with a lot of left wing revisionists, those who want to say that the empire was only evil and we need to tear down the statues and we need to hide our heads, bow our heads in shame. I think that they view the world. I think the reason the British Empire in particular gets so much stigma is because we were the largest empire. I mean, look at what the Belgians done in the Congo. Look at French massacres. Indeed, as Mr. Segura himself acknowledged, Mughal Empire was hardly violence free. Every empire has blood on its hands. Every empire, without question, without exception. I think the reason that the British get exceptional disdain is because we were the largest. I mean, the sun literally never set in the British Empire. Critics would say the blood never dried on the British Empire. But if you ask me as a British person, do I feel ashamed of the British Empire? What's my answer? My answer is I am ashamed of some of the things we've done, which were brutal, despicable, and savage. In fact, after the massacre, Dyer proposed that that spot where the missionary was killed should be turned into a shrine, and Indians should be made to crawl there. So I am ashamed of those clearly racist attitudes that we held. I am ashamed that a lot of our wealth was brought about by exploitation. But if you ask me, I'm ashamed of the empire as a whole. I have to be honest, and the answer is no, because I also believe a lot of positive things came out of the empire. The Westminster system of government, rule of law, for the most part, obviously in Dyer's case, that's not, he escaped justice. But the general principles that came from imperial influence, were there. I mean, I think often when we look at empire, it's this idea that before empire, everything was one big utopian paradise. And I think that's often the problem with viewing empire in a solely negative light. You then go on to say, well, what was the alternative? And the alternative presenting it as some sort of utopia. Mughal India was not a utopia. There was also famines in Mughal India, and there was violence. Um, and I think there's a lot of young left wing students who are basically taking on this Marxist worldview where the evil British are to blame for everything. And I mean, there is no question about it today. It may be true that in the past we glossed over these things and we didn't, bring it into the education system. But universities today, there is definitely a far left narrative whereby you have to feel ashamed of being British. And the Union Jack is the butcher's apron. And there is a real vitriolic view of British power and the British Empire. And in this uncertain era in Brexit, I am not going to be one of those people that endorses any notion that we need to go around bowing our heads in shame and submission. We should acknowledge what happened, but a full apology would mean reparations, and then you get into a question of, well, where does it end? Because no Indian alive today, or very, very, very few Indians alive today, were directly impacted by that. India's now been independent for 72 years. So with independence comes responsibility and a sense of self determination. And if India doesn't redress its own record since then, I don't see why we should offer an apology. I don't see why we should give reparation when the Indian governments, respective Indian governments, won't give reparation to their own people for atrocities committed by Indian troops. I have this book. I haven't got around to reading it yet, but it's a very comprehensive book. The author is Ramachandra Guha, India After Gandhi. It's beautifully illustrated, actually. It's very elaborate cover. But one photograph is found striking. Like I say, I haven't read this yet, but it's a group of women, and they are in. Yeah, I'll try and show this picture. It's in Manipur. Women in Manipur protesting atrocities committed by the Indian Army, July 2004. And it says, Indian Army rapes us. Now, in India, where there is intense nationalism, questioning the army is like a no-no because they're brave patriots, and it's basically it's basically taboo. It's basically, I don't think it's illegal technically, but it's you could end up getting lynched if you question the army in India. We think we're militaristic. I mean, from what I've seen, questioning military. I mean, this is why I find it galling to talk about British transparency when no one can really openly question the military in India. Because, and I think the reason for this is because Indian troops have shown bravery. They have, taken on Islamist terrorists in, for example, the Mumbai attacks and so on. So they're revered. But they have also committed atrocities over the last 72 years. They have in Kashmir, in Manipur, in Nagaland. So if the Indian army, if the Indian government isn't transparent on that, I don't see why we should apologise. But on wider issues of empire, I mean, we should acknowledge it, but a full apology is a different thing. Now, on wider issues of empire, I believe the empire absolutely should be taught, and I believe that children should be taught that we exploited people, that it was based on racist attitudes, and that we done some pretty bad things. Amritsar are certainly not alone. I mean, in Ireland, we did commit atrocities, Croke Park in Dublin, and there's many others, goes without saying. But I think empire should be judged also in context, and as the British Empire was the largest, I think a fair comparison is to look at how it compares against other empires. Were we the worst empire? Were we the most ruthless empire? I would say no, we weren't. Not given that we were the largest. I mean, compare the British Empire to the Mongol Empire. Millions, millions died in the Mongol conquests, but modern day Mongolia, still reveres Genghis Khan. Chinese empires. China today loves to say they've never invaded another land. That's sheer propaganda. They have actually on several occasions. Ask Vietnamese people about Chinese influence there, not to mention the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. So the point I would conclude with is this: power corrupts, power is greed, and every power in history has blood on its hands. No major power, none, can honestly, with a straight face, say we are innocent. Whether it be the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, the Mongol Empire, various Chinese dynasties, modern American power, the Soviet Union, the Indian government, Turkey, you name it. None of the world's major powers can honestly, with a straight face, Imperial Japan for that matter, with a straight face, say we are innocent. And I do feel that too much of the guilt mongering, too much of the revisionism, particularly in British universities today, is solely directed at the West. So, if, for example, British students are learning about the wrongs of the British Empire, they should also learn about what's been happening in post independence India. Balance it out. I have no problem with students learning that General Dyer was a pretty cold and ruthless man. And he was, it's right that he's called the Butcher of Amritsar because what he done was absolutely unforgivable. And of course, his descendants are going to make excuses for him. But I think all the reliable testimony of the time does suggest that it was absolutely, irrefutably a massacre against unarmed people. But I don't think we should go for a full apology. The same with slavery. Why? Because for years, British sailors risked their lives infiltrating slave ships. In fact, the British Empire abolished the slave trade in 1807 across the empire, in the United Kingdom in 1807 and across the empire in 1831. And for years, it was the Royal Navy that was the world police in actually tackling slave ships. Slavery today, again, all of this is history. If we're talking about the evils of the transatlantic slave trade, but ignoring the fact there are 27 million slaves in the world today, and what's the country that leads that? Mauritania in West Africa. So, as a British person, I acknowledge our past. I do. And I don't agree with those conservatives who say, let's just downplay it. But by the same token, I do not like those on the revisionist left. I do not agree with those who say it was pure evil and that's it, and we must bow our heads in shame, and the British flag is something to be ashamed of. I love my country, and I'm not going to apologise for recognising the empire for what it was. It was an empire, it lasted over 200 years, and yes, there was a lot of bad, there was. But if it was purely evil, if it was purely exploitative, if it was purely bad, it wouldn't have lasted so long. And that's something I think needs to be looked at in a balanced way.